My name is Robert Levine. I'm a journalist, the former executive editor of Billboard magazine, and I just wrote a book called Free Ride: How the Internet is Destroying the Culture Business and How the Culture Business Could Fight Back. 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago, when Napster came out, I thought it was the greatest thing ever, like most people did, and I thought the internet is going to give artists a way to deal with the public directly, and we're going to have this great market where people can reach right out to their favorite bands, and it's not going to be bound by this sort of traditional record company deal, which can be good or bad for artists, but now they'll have other options. And I was very optimistic because I thought that this idea of sharing music for free was not, I thought it was a step in the evolution. I didn't think it was a solution. And over the next decade, gradually I started to think, why isn't that market happening? Why don't you see indie labels thriving? Why don't you see more musicians going from unknown to famous to the point where they have big careers? Why do so many musicians still want major label investment? And I thought that one of the reasons was it's just very hard to sell anything online because there's zero copyright enforcement. And I started to think of copyright as, it's not only a way for big companies to make money, it's a way for artists to make money. And the more I thought about it, the more I started to question the same things that a lot of people who grew up with the internet probably believe. And the book sort of came out of that questioning. And for a long time, to get back to why I did the book, I thought this is a really interesting subject for a book. A lot of people write about what's going on from the perspective that copyright is evil, or from the perspective that it's like this essential of a civilized society. I don't think I would go that far in either direction, but also a lot of people, most of the people who write about copyright do so from the perspective that it's the worst idea in the history of the human race. And a lot of them are professors, so they don't need copyright. They have tenure. They always make a living. So I wanted to provide another perspective, which is copyright has problems. It should be updated, but I'm doing it as someone, I make my living through copyright. I don't sell books on the corner. I'm not that independent, but I am independent in the sense that I don't have a salary. I don't even have health insurance in the US. I would have a hard time getting it. I created a book. I sold it to Random House, licensed it to Random House really, and that's how I make my living. So I thought it's just a different perspective that I think people should have, because whatever the problems with copyright, it does help us create a lot of culture that I think will be very difficult to do in any kind of collective way. The second biggest problem with copyright is that it lasts 70 years. But the biggest problem with copyright is that it lasts 7 minutes. As soon as my book was published in the US, there were unauthorized copies available online. People on the internet tend to see copyright as something that gets in the way of them doing what they want to do. So in the case of copyright, there's a law that restricts you from distributing my book without compensating me, without my permission. Now, for a lot of people, that's an inconvenient law because they really want to download my book for free, or they really want to remix it, or they really want to make a business distributing it. And that might be a good thing. But if they do that, I wouldn't make a living. Therefore, all societies have in some way granted authors rights to their work. Otherwise, you wouldn't have people doing the same kind of work they do because they wouldn't have the money. So that gives me permission. So it means something very different to me. Now, in my case, I don't mind if people remix my book. But what's interesting is no one has. When I go online, I don't see any creative remixes of my book. And just let me say, I am dying for a cool version of my book with zombies. So if that's, if any of you are into zombies, come on, help me out here. What I see is people distributing my book for profit as a business. Now that does really bother me. If someone downloads it illegally without paying, it's an annoyance, but I guess I could understand that. I don't think it's a grave injustice. But the idea that people in Brazil are making money distributing my book, that does really bother me, because that's not, quote unquote, a kid who wants to read it. That's someone who's doing it as a business. And that, I think, is why we have copyright. Like, copyright was always a business-to-business law. One business is an authorized distributor, the other isn't. But it ultimately benefits artists. I gave Random House the right to distribute it. They give me a royalty. I did not give anyone in Brazil a right to distribute it. They give me no royalty. So that's obviously a problem. And when people talk about copyright on the internet, I feel that perspective is kind of absent. You know, I understand the justification for wanting something and downloading it illegally, but what's the justification for the Pirate Bay? What is the justification for making a huge business, and the Pirate Bay is a huge business, don't kid yourself, out of distributing other people's work? It's just it's an indefensible position, and when people defend it, it really does bother me. I think regulating copyright seems like a good idea. The current copyright system puts more and more under law. Terms get longer, coverage gets wider. That makes it hard to do some things creatively. At the same time, you have this other problem, which is the law is largely theoretical. It's not really enforced. So again, you have what to me is the worst of all possible worlds. It's that much harder to invest in an album, in a movie, in a book, because your likelihood of making your money back is really seriously impacted by piracy. At the same time, if you're a remix artist, more and more is under copyright. So we have, in some ways, what's really the worst possible system you could ever create. And it seems to be getting worse in that more and more goes under coverage, and less of those laws are actually enforced. So I think you get to this point where what you can do legally is extremely constrained. What you can do illegally is not constrained at all. And you just get this really the worst case scenario. The first thing we need to do is start enforcing the laws as they are. There's a lot of interesting proposals to change copyright law. I think some of them are really smart. I think others are really silly. But one of my problems is that a lot of the proposals I hear from people who are against copyright, they don't actually involve changing the law. They involve not enforcing the law. So if you were going to say, I want to create a bigger safe space for fair use, I'm all in favor of that. If you want to lower the length of copyright, I'm fine with that. But too often what I hear is, we want to increase safe harbors. We want to decrease intermediary liability. But to me, what that means isn't you're changing the law. What that means is you're making it very, very difficult to enforce the law as it is. You know, one of the things that they're talking about in the US is what they call a small claims court for copyright. So let's say I want to enforce my rights. There's two big problems. The problem people talk about is that, oh my God, the highest penalty for copyright infringement is $150,000. Do you want to sue little kids for $150,000? Not at all. The part people don't talk about is that in order to get that $150,000, I could easily go through $200,000 in legal costs. And what I'd like to do, what I would like to do is not have to sue anybody ever because people respect my rights. That's a fantasy. Let's get real. What I would like to do is have a way to spend $100 to sue somebody for $500. It's enough money that it hurts, they won't do it again. It's enough money that I'm not going to sue people just for fun, but artists who have no money can do it. I think that's what we need. But aside from the US Copyright Office, I don't see a lot of people working on that. But I think that one thing that is promising is sort of private agreements. In the US, you had ISPs basically agree to some monitoring system where if people are caught downloading a certain amount, they'll be subject to some penalty after a number of warnings. Presumably involves slowing internet access, not cutting people off from the internet. I think that's a good thing. I don't think it's going to be as big a deal as anyone thinks. I don't think it's going to cut infringement as much as some people would like. And I don't think it's going to impact people as harshly as other people might imagine. I think a lot of parents are going to get notices from telephone companies and yell at their kids. But I don't think that's a terrible thing. I don't think that's as big a deal as people think. What you're seeing is piracy moves more and more to cyber lockers. And now we have to find a way to cut down on some of these cyber lockers. on some level, every artist wants two things. You want your work to be exposed, and you want to make a living, whatever kind of living you want, from that art. So if you want the maximum number of people to see your work, the easiest thing to do is to give it away. What I see from a lot of policy groups like Creative Commons is sign your rights away, you don't need them. Not only do they want you not to enforce your rights, they want you to sign them away. I'm unaware of another civil society group that has generated so much enthusiasm for signing away rights that you have, that in Europe are considered fundamental rights. And Creative Commons, it markets itself as this great creative organization. But if you think about it, it's basically created a way to sign away your rights. Now, that might be a good thing, but if you marketed it as a way to sign away your rights, I wonder if people would be as enthusiastic about it as they are now. The same internet culture that rewards free stuff can be terrible for generating new assignments. Because someone can post, a company is looking for an illustrator, they can put something on an internet bulletin board and say, hey, we'd like someone to do this, who's willing to do it for free? A lot of people will volunteer. And guess what? That makes it very hard to make a living from your art. It's not as a result of what you did directly, but it's as a result, the kind of system you're contributing to by giving things away for free may make it harder for everyone to make a living in the long run. So if you organized auto workers to work for free and undermined a union, you'd be seen as a horrible conservative. But when you organize artists to work for free, in a way that helps, let's not kid ourselves, in a way that helps a large corporation, it's considered to be this progressive, cool thing to do. Why is there that divide there? Why is Creative Commons considered a great thing and working for free at an auto plant considered a horrible thing? That's something I really don't understand. To me, undermining the income of working people, whether it's legal or not, or good for society or not, it's not really considered a cool, progressive thing to do. Why does that change online? When people talk about remixes, I think that I'm going to be very unpopular for saying this. I think there's a tendency to exaggerate the importance of the remix. As someone who grew up as a huge music fan, and really I started covering the music business because I loved music, not the other way around, the remix is this idea that goes back to dub reggae and even before that. If you go to Stanford Law School or the Berkman Center at Harvard, there's this idea that the remix is this thing that came out of the internet. But it goes far beyond that, and people were doing remixes either legally or in a gray area of legality before that. But the truth is, the demand for some of this remix art can be pretty low. And also, the question of what's a remix and how much of something you're using is very complicated. Let me give you an example. Most times when I do an interview, somebody asks me, under current copyright law, the Beastie Boys album, Paul's Boutique, would be illegal. Don't you think that's horrible? And my answer is, yeah, I think that's horrible. Paul's Boutique is a great creative work and I think it should be legal. And the next question is often, shouldn't we make all remixing legal? And I say, okay, what about some of those Puff Daddy songs where he's basically taking an existing song and shouting over it? Don't you think the original artist deserves some money? And the answer almost always is, well, yeah, of course. All Puff Daddy does is yell. And that's why it's very hard to make a law, because what you want is, if the Beastie Boys are using very small sections of songs in a way that puts them in a totally new context and puts them in a brilliant new creative work, most people would say that should be legal. If someone takes only the hook of a song, repeats it in a way that everyone recognizes it, and he's only using hits, songs that were hits already are likely to be hits again, and he's not really changing much, should he have to pay? Most people say yes. And that's why it's very hard to come up with a law that's fair to both people. But the other thing is that, you can't have great remix art without having great art. The example I use is Chad Vader. I don't know if you've seen Chad Vader on YouTube. It's this great show about Darth Vader's younger brother, who's a convenience store manager. He manages like I guess we would call it a 7-Eleven. I don't know if you have that here. He basically runs around the convenience store terrorizing people using like the Force choking when they're late for their work. And it's very funny. It's really great. You know, should this be legal? Yes. But if we didn't have a copyright system that protected Star Wars, we wouldn't have Chad Vader. Because the thing is, if you showed that to someone who had never seen Star Wars, I'm not sure you could find such a person, but if, they wouldn't think it's funny at all. Without Star Wars, it's a guy in a black suit with a breathy voice yelling at people. It's just not funny. If you want to have remix art, you need remixers, but you also need great art to remix. And I think that one of the things people forget is like, if you don't have great art to remix, what do you have? And the other thing that's interesting is a lot of the things that get remixed the most are iconic, important stuff, not sort of marginal culture. You know, if you look on the internet, there's a ton of great remixes of Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings. These are all works that were created by the sort of, you know, the same kind of like cultural industrial complex that bloggers say they hate so much. Yet that's the culture they consume, albeit in remixed form. If you didn't have the kind of financing and the kind of copyright, the kind of regulatory system that made it possible to make big Star Wars and Star Trek movies, what would you be remixing?